November 19th, 1944. The frost in northeastern France clung to the ground like a warning. Visibility was low. The air carried the metallic smell of burned fuel and mud churned by tracks. On the outskirts of a small town called Burgaltroff, a German anti-tank gunner named Erich Schmidt peered through the narrow slit of his sight, searching for movement. He had been in this position for 3 days, trading shells with a stubborn group of American tanks that refused to back down. But this morning something felt different. Through the haze of exhaust and morning mist, Schmidt spotted a Sherman tank, its hull scarred, engine coughing, armor cracked from repeated hits, still advancing. It should have been disabled. Instead, it crawled forward, turret turning with purpose. Then he saw what he could hardly believe. The tank commander, a tall black American soldier, half exposed from the waist up, manning the .50 caliber machine gun and returning fire with fearless precision. Even at this distance, Schmidt could see the defiance in that figure's stance, the kind that ignores pain, fear, and even the laws of survival. That commander was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of the 761st Tank Battalion, a man whose determination that day would both inspire his comrades and haunt his enemies. What Schmidt witnessed didn't fit into anything he had been taught. German soldiers were raised under the idea that black men were physically inferior, mentally incapable, and too cowardly for mechanized warfare. And yet, in that frozen field, the inferior soldier was doing what few others would dare, staying exposed atop a damaged tank, firing until his last breath. Only later would history reveal the extent of Rivers's injury. His leg had been torn open days earlier when his tank struck a mine. Medics said it was gangrenous. He refused morphine, refused evacuation, and instead took command of another vehicle. His reason was simple. His men still needed him, and the mission wasn't done. When his commander ordered him back, Rivers replied, "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." For Schmidt, watching through his scope, the sight was both terrifying and confusing. Every bullet he fired at that tank felt like firing at the collapse of a belief system. Nazi ideology preached that courage, intelligence, and technical skill belonged only to the so-called superior races. What he saw that day crushed that illusion. Moments later, Rivers's tank took a direct hit. The explosion ripped through the vehicle, sending smoke into the sky. Schmidt lowered his weapon, shaken. He had just witnessed a man fight through the impossible, not for ideology, not even for survival, but for conviction. That encounter marked more than the end of one man's life. It was the beginning of a revelation for the Germans, for the Americans, and for a world built on flawed hierarchies. Because the story of Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers and the 761st Tank Battalion wasn't about proving who could fight. It was about exposing who was wrong all along, and to understand how that single moment on a frozen French morning came to pass, we have to go back to the deep south of the United States 2 years earlier, where the U.S. Army created a tank battalion it never intended to trust. To understand the courage that burned through the fog of France in 1944, you have to start in a place where courage alone wasn't enough. Louisiana, 1942. The U.S. Army had just activated a new tank battalion at Camp Claiborne. Officially, it was the 761st Tank Battalion. Unofficially, it was an experiment, a political gesture meant to quiet criticism over segregation in the military. The War Department called it a necessary measure to maintain Negro morale, as if morale could replace equality. Few in Washington expected the battalion to see real combat. Fewer still believed it could make history. The United States in 1942 was at war on 2 fronts, one overseas and one at home. Jim Crow laws still ruled the South, and racial segregation stretched deep into the armed forces. Black soldiers could fight and die for their country, but they couldn't eat in the same mess hall as white troops. They could train for war, but rarely lead in it. They could wear the uniform, but not the same respect. For the men of the 761st, every order, every drill, every day was a reminder that they weren't just fighting to serve their country, they were fighting to prove they deserved to. The battalion's motto would become, "Come out fighting." But at the time, it wasn't just about the enemy ahead. It was about the prejudice behind them. When the 761st began training, most white armored units were being shipped overseas after 12 to 16 weeks of preparation. The 761st trained for nearly 2 years. 2 years of drills, tactics, and endless repetition, not because they needed more time, but because the Army refused to trust them. The message was clear. If they failed, it wouldn't just reflect on a single unit. It would be used to justify every racist assumption about black soldiers. That pressure could have broken most men. Instead, it built some of the toughest tankers the U.S. Army would ever see. At the center of it all was Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, a white officer who accepted command of the battalion when others warned him it would end his career. Bates didn't care. He had seen black soldiers fight alongside French colonial troops during World War I, and he knew skill had nothing to do with skin color. From the start, he treated his men as professionals, demanding perfection, but giving respect. He told them, if you're going to be judged differently, then give them nothing to judge you by except excellence. That mindset shaped everything. The 761st learned to repair engines in total darkness. They memorized tank procedures by heart. They moved as one, with precision that outperformed most white units. What began as a political token slowly became something the Army couldn't ignore. A battalion too good to sideline, and among these men stood a quiet giant, Ruben Rivers, 6'2", born in Oklahoma, raised on a farm. He wasn't the loudest, but when he spoke, others listened. Officers said he had a sixth sense for terrain and tactics. Fellow tankers called him fearless. He carried himself with the kind of calm that doesn't need to prove itself, the kind that shows up when it matters most. But the story of the 761st wasn't just about Rivers or Bates. It was about hundreds of men united by the same contradiction, serving a nation that didn't yet serve them back. They trained on segregated bases, ate segregated meals, and fought through segregated expectations. Yet day after day, they prepared to fight for freedom, not just for others, but for the idea that one day it would include them. By the time they completed their training, they were ready for anything. But the Army wasn't ready for them. For months, the 761st remained stateside, waiting for orders that never came. It wasn't until the tide of war began turning, when white battalions were exhausted and losses mounted, that the Army finally decided to send the Black Panthers to the front lines. What the War Department saw as a desperate substitution, history would remember as a turning point. Because when those tanks finally rolled out of Louisiana, they carried more than ammunition. They carried 2 years of frustration, pride, and a promise to prove every skeptic wrong. Before the 761st ever fired a shot, one of its most famous members fought a different kind of battle, not on a European field, but on a Texas Army base. His name was Jack Roosevelt Robinson, a young officer with sharp instincts, an athlete's build, and a stubborn refusal to accept humiliation. Most people know him today as the man who broke baseball's color barrier in 1947. But before the stadium lights, before the cheers, Robinson's first confrontation with segregation happened in uniform. It was July 1944 at Fort Hood, Texas. Robinson was serving with the 761st Tank Battalion, recently transferred there during their endless wait for deployment. That evening, he boarded a military bus. When he sat near the front, the white driver turned and barked an order that Robinson already knew too well. Move to the back. The Army had issued regulations banning racial segregation on base transportation. But in the South, those rules existed mostly on paper. Robinson refused. The bus fell silent. The driver stopped the vehicle and called the MPs. Within minutes, Robinson found himself surrounded, accused of insubordination. The moment escalated into a full arrest. Word spread through the base within hours. Some officers expected a quiet court-martial to make an example of him. But when the paperwork reached Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, he refused to sign it. Bates told his superiors he wouldn't court-martial a man for following Army law. His refusal didn't end the matter. Instead, higher command transferred Robinson to another unit, whose commander would authorize the charges. Robinson stood trial in a military courtroom where prejudice weighed heavier than evidence. Yet the case collapsed under its own contradictions. The bus driver's testimony was inconsistent, the regulations were clear, and the panel could sense the injustice. Robinson was acquitted on all charges, But the ordeal ended his path with the 761st. Before the battalion shipped out, he was reassigned to the 758th Tank Battalion and soon discharged for medical reasons. The war he'd prepared for would go on without him. But that moment, that refusal to move, became something larger than anyone on that base could have imagined. It was a spark that predated the civil rights movement, a preview of the defiance that would later echo in ballparks and across America. The men of the 761st never forgot it. They carried his name with pride, a reminder that fighting back didn't always mean pulling a trigger. When the battalion finally deployed months later, Robinson's absence was felt. Yet his stand against segregation mirrored what every man in that unit was about to face on a global stage. The Army could separate them by color, but it couldn't contain their purpose. In a way, Robinson had already fought their first battle, the one for dignity. By the time the 761st crossed the Atlantic, his seat on that bus had turned into a symbol. Proof that courage doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins the moment you refuse to bow. By mid-1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical point. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy, but pushing through France was proving slower and bloodier than expected. German resistance was fierce, and every fresh unit mattered. That was when the U.S. Army finally turned to a battalion it had long kept on standby, the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. After 2 years of waiting, they were ordered overseas. On June 9, 1944, just 3 days after D-Day, the 761st received their long-awaited deployment orders. They boarded the British troop ship Esperance Bay and crossed the Atlantic under constant threat of U-boat attack. When they arrived in England that September, the men expected to be quickly sent into battle. Instead, they were told to wait again. White officers debated where, or even if, the 761st should be assigned to combat. Rumors spread through the camp that the battalion would be stuck with maintenance duties, far from the front. The frustration was intense. These were men who had trained for nearly 2 years, perfecting every maneuver, memorizing every gear and gun. They hadn't come across the ocean to watch others fight. Then came the unexpected call. General George S. Patton wanted them. Patton was known for brilliance, arrogance, and unfiltered opinions. In letters to his wife, he had written doubts about black troops' ability to think fast enough for armored warfare. To him, speed, intuition, and split-second decisions defined tank combat. And yet, by October 1944, Patton's Third Army needed reinforcements badly. The Germans had dug in across eastern France, and Patton was burning through units faster than replacements could arrive. When he asked for a fresh tank battalion, his staff hesitated before mentioning the 761st. Patton's reply was skeptical but decisive. "I don't care what color they are, as long as they can fight." Before sending them into battle, Patton addressed the men personally at their staging area. His speech became part of the battalion's legend. "Men," he said, "you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those German sons of—" He stopped himself, grinned, and added, "Everyone's watching you. Don't let me down." For the 761st, that moment was electric. They were finally being recognized, and not as a gesture, but as soldiers. Yet Patton's words were a double-edged sword. Everyone's watching meant that any mistake could confirm every racist doubt that lingered in the Army. They carried not just weapons, but the burden of representation. In early November, they got their first combat assignment: support the 26th Infantry Division near the small French town of Morville-l'Évêque. It was cold, wet, and miserable. The kind of battlefield that turned every tank into a steel coffin. The German defenders were experienced, confident, and heavily armed. They expected the colored tank battalion to break at the first shot. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Because when the 761st rolled into Morville, their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bates, didn't give them a speech about history or pride. He simply said, "Gentlemen, this is what we trained for." Then the engines roared to life, and the Black Panthers went to war. November 7, thus, 1944. The fields outside the French town of Morville-l'Évêque were soaked in freezing rain. Mud pooled at the tank treads, Wind cut through uniforms, and the gray horizon hid German gun barrels waiting in silence. For the first time, the 761st Tank Battalion was about to face the enemy it had trained 2 long years to meet. No second chances, no rehearsals. This was their proving ground. The Germans holding the town were veterans of the Wehrmacht, backed by anti-tank guns, and infantry who had spent weeks preparing ambush lines. Their intelligence briefings told them that a Negro battalion was approaching, soldiers who, according to Nazi and even some American propaganda, would crumble at first contact. They braced for an easy victory. What came at them instead was a wall of moving steel and relentless precision. At 0600, the first Shermans of Company A rolled forward under a pale dawn. The lead tank, commanded by Staff Sergeant Samuel King, took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust and burst into flames. 2 crewmen were wounded. Instead of retreating, nearby Panthers, that's what the 761st called themselves, pulled their comrades from the wreckage while machine gun fire raked the street. Within minutes, King's crew was evacuated and the German gunner silenced. The Black Panthers pushed deeper into Morville. For the Germans watching from rooftops, confusion replaced confidence. Every time one tank was hit, 2 more pressed forward, coordinating by radio with crisp, disciplined commands. Advance left, cover crossfire, suppress at 0400. These weren't panicked troops. They were professionals. On the southern approach, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers encountered a German roadblock of heavy timbers and mines that stalled the column. Without waiting for orders, Rivers climbed out of his tank under small arms fire, attached a tow cable, remounted, and ordered his driver to pull the obstacle clear. The column roared through, crushing the last barricade and clearing the way for infantry to seize the town center. Witnesses said the move looked impossible, doing recovery work under direct fire. Yet it turned the tide of the fight. For that act, Rivers would later receive the Silver Star. The battle lasted roughly 4 hours. When the smoke cleared, Morville-l'Évêque belonged to the Allies. German after-action reports recovered later described an enemy tank unit displaying exceptional tactical proficiency. What shocked them most wasn't the firepower. It was the discipline, the refusal to break formation, the relentless communication between crews. The 761st had just proven in its first combat that all the prejudice stacked against it was built on lies. As the sun dipped behind the shattered church steeple, the Panthers stood beside their tanks, cold, muddy, exhausted, but unbroken. They had earned their commander's quiet nod and something even rarer in 1944, respect. Word of their success traveled quickly up the chain of command and across enemy lines. The men who were never meant to fight had just changed the conversation. But for Ruben Rivers and his crew, Morville was only the beginning. Within days, they would drive straight into the kind of hell no training could prepare them for. And the wound that should have ended his war would become the legend that defined it. After Burgultrauf, there was no pause, no reprieve, no chance to recover. The 761st Tank Battalion had been tested in its first battles, and now command discovered what kind of soldiers they really were. From November 1944 to May 1945, the Black Panthers would fight for 183 consecutive days, an unbroken chain of combat that few units in the entire U.S. Army could match. The average white tank battalion rotated off the front lines every 2 weeks. The 761st didn't. They stayed in the fight because replacements never came. Day after day, they moved through towns whose names blurred together: Gebling, Morville, Tilley, Klimbach, Lacroix, Tilley, Bastogne. Every village was another ambush, another set of mines, another test of their endurance. They slept in mud beside burned-out tanks. They ate cold rations in foxholes surrounded by the wrecks of both friend and foe. Their engines froze overnight. Men warmed their hands over exhaust pipes before dawn. Yet every morning, those same tanks rolled forward again. Each battle seemed to stack against them. They faced seasoned German units, veterans of the Eastern Front who knew every trick of armored warfare. Their opponents had Panthers and Tigers, machines heavier and deadlier than the Shermans the 761st drove. On paper, the math never favored them. A German 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from half a mile away. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't pierce the Tiger's armor from the front at all. So the Panthers learned to improvise. They moved faster, flanked harder, and used terrain as their weapon. Cat hunting, they called it, bait one German tank into firing, while two others circled around for the kill. It was suicide-level courage disguised as tactics. The statistics tell only part of the story. 156 casualties in 1 month, 71 tanks lost or damaged, thousands of shells fired, but numbers can't describe what it took to keep fighting. Maintenance crews rebuilt tanks overnight under shell fire. Gunners fired until the barrels glowed red, and when one man fell, another took his place without ceremony. As Sergeant Warren G. Creasy, nicknamed Iron Man, once said, "We didn't have time to think about dying, only about getting it done." By late winter, the battalion's legend was spreading. German prisoners, stunned after capture, kept asking the same question. How many Negro Panzer divisions are there? They refused to believe it was just one battalion. To them, the 761st had seemed everywhere at once. Their persistence broke not just German defenses, but German propaganda itself. The men Nazi ideology called inferior were outperforming some of America's best-trained white units, and the evidence was impossible to ignore. Still, the cost was brutal. Rivers was gone, and others soon followed. Some crews were down to 2 or 3 veterans holding the line with raw replacements. There were no long breaks, no fresh troops waiting in reserve. The only thing keeping them together was pride, and the unspoken understanding that if they failed, the blame wouldn't fall on them alone. It would fall on their entire race. When asked later how they endured, one tanker put it simply, "We couldn't quit. If we quit, they'd say we weren't good enough, so we didn't." For 6 relentless months, through ice, exhaustion, and grief, the Black Panthers did what every manual said was impossible. They fought without rest, and they never broke. December 1944. The snow came early that year, blanketing the forests of Belgium in silence thick enough to hide an army. The Germans were planning one last desperate counterattack, a gamble meant to split the Allied lines and force a peace on their terms. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge. It would become one of the bloodiest and coldest battles of the entire war. And in that chaos, the 761st Tank Battalion was called once again to do the impossible. The Ardennes offensive erupted on December 16th, when more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed into thinly held Allied lines. American units were overrun, roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, fuel depots burned, snow mixed with smoke until even day looked like twilight. General Patton's Third Army, positioned to the south, was ordered to turn north, an enormous pivot in freezing conditions, and break through to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne Division trapped at Bastogne. Among the first units ordered forward, the 761st Tank Battalion. Their reputation had already spread through Patton's command. These were the same Black Panthers who hadn't rested in months, who fought through every setback and still advanced. But Bastogne was different. The Germans held the high ground, their tanks hidden behind snow-covered ridges, their 80 mm guns ready to tear through anything that moved. The roads were ice. Engines froze before sunrise. It was a nightmare for armor. Yet that's exactly where the Panthers were sent. For the next 3 weeks, they fought through blizzards and artillery barrages, clearing road after road for Patton's advance. Visibility was often just a few feet. Tanks fired blind, guided only by radio and instinct. At night, the horizon flashed white and red as tracer rounds sliced through the falling snow. The men barely slept, surviving on cold rations and adrenaline. Every mile cost them another tank, another friend. But something else was happening. Patton, the same general who had once doubted their ability, began to trust them completely. When German infiltrators disguised as American soldiers began ambushing convoys, Patton made a bold decision. He assigned the 761st to guard critical checkpoints and gave orders to shoot any white soldier who couldn't give the correct password. That level of trust was unheard of at the time. The general who once questioned their intelligence now depended on them to protect his entire army's supply lines. The battle turned in January. On the 9th, the 761st helped liberate Tillet, cutting off German escape routes and allowing Patton's forces to reach Bastogne. The roads were littered with burned-out tanks, twisted metal, and frozen bodies, silent witnesses to how close the Allies had come to collapse. But the 761st had held their ground, often outnumbered and outgunned, proving once again that courage mattered more than color. When the snow finally began to melt, the Black Panthers stood among the survivors of one of the most brutal campaigns in history. They had lost men, machines, and sleep, but gained something no enemy could take: respect. From that point on, no one in Patton's command questioned whether black soldiers could fight. They had fought, bled, and won in the coldest winter of the war. By the start of 1945, the Black Panthers had earned something far more dangerous than recognition: reputation. German troops began whispering about a black tank unit that never stopped advancing, even when half its men were gone. The stories spread through captured trenches and interrogation reports, twisting from disbelief into superstition. To the Wehrmacht, they were no longer just an armored battalion. They were a specter that refused to die. It began during the bitter winter fighting across Belgium and Luxembourg. The snow came down in sheets, blinding tank periscopes and freezing the oil in gun barrels. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. Men lost fingers to frostbite just trying to reload. And still the Panthers moved. Their tanks rumbled through ghost towns of shattered stone, their black faces streaked with soot and oil, emerging through the fog like something out of a nightmare for the soldiers they faced. The Germans' own propaganda had built this fear. For years, they'd been told that black soldiers were wild, undisciplined, and merciless, a tool to terrify enemies, not real fighters. But the 761st defied that image in every way. They fought with precision and control. They took prisoners, shared rations, and treated the wounded on both sides. And yet, to the terrified German infantrymen, that discipline made them even more terrifying. Many believed capture by black troops meant certain death. In truth, the Panthers were among the most professional units in the field. Their restraint in the face of what they'd endured became a weapon of its own. Inside the battalion, the atmosphere was different. Less myth, more survival. The men were exhausted, running on muscle memory and grit. Tank commanders kept their radios short. Advance left. Cover that ridge. We're hit, but moving. Underneath it all was a rhythm, the mechanical hum of determination. Every mile they gained proved something the world had doubted, that excellence had no color. One of their medics later said the strangest part wasn't the fighting, it was how the enemy reacted after. Some Germans cried when they saw us, he recalled, not because they were scared to die, but because they couldn't understand why we'd fight for a country that treated us like less. That contradiction haunted both sides. The soldiers of the 761st were dismantling Nazi ideology on the battlefield, even as segregation waited for them back home. As the battalion pushed deeper into Germany, fear shifted. The propaganda that once fueled hatred now cracked under reality. German morale reports noted, colored American tankers exhibiting remarkable tactical discipline and persistence. Entire units surrendered rather than face them again. The myth of racial superiority was burning out, destroyed not by speeches, but by the sound of tank treads crushing it into the mud. For the 761st, this wasn't redemption, it was revelation. They weren't fighting just to win a war. They were proving that the lies that fueled both enemies, Nazi and American racism alike, couldn't survive contact with truth. And every mile forward, every burned-out Tiger tank they left behind was another nail in that coffin. But what came next would test their humanity more than any battle ever could. It wasn't gunfire or tanks waiting ahead. It was the discovery of what those lies had built, and the horror that waited behind barbed wire. It was May 5th, 1945, when the 761st Tank Battalion rolled into Austria. The war in Europe was all but over, though the fighting hadn't stopped yet. Rumors of German surrender were circulating, but the Panthers were still pushing forward, clearing out small pockets of resistance. The air was heavy with smoke, the smell of burning fuel and spring mud, and something else they couldn't yet name. Near the small town of Gunskirchen, scouts reported barbed wire and a cluster of wooden barracks. At first, they thought it was another German supply depot. But as the tanks drew closer, the silence was wrong. No gunfire, no movement, just wind through the trees. Then they saw them. Behind the fences stood thousands of prisoners, emaciated, skeletal figures wrapped in rags, some crawling, some standing, others lying motionless in the mud. It wasn't a military camp. It was a concentration camp, one of the countless satellites of Mauthausen. Over 15,000 prisoners, mostly Hungarian Jews, had been left behind when the SS guards fled days earlier. Many were already dead. Those still alive barely resembled human beings. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens recalled the moment decades later. They were skin and bones. Some smiled, some cried. We gave them everything we had, our rations, our chocolate, our water. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. The Black Panthers, men who had been told their own lives were worth less, were now liberating the survivors of the world's greatest act of racial hatred. The irony hit every man hard. These starving, trembling people looked at them not with fear, but with awe. One young woman later wrote a poem titled "The Black Messiah," remembering the soldier who carried her from the barracks. A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah. For the 761st, the battlefield had turned into something else entirely, a revelation of what they'd really been fighting for. This was the physical proof of what hatred could build when left unchecked. And it wasn't a victory that anyone celebrated. There were no cheers, no medals handed out that day, only silence and the quiet sobbing of those too weak to stand. As they buried the dead and shared what little food they had left, the men realized their mission had changed. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were witnesses. And what they saw in Gunskirchen would follow them for the rest of their lives. The war ended days later, May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The 761st had crossed 6 countries and fought for 183 days straight. They destroyed hundreds of German vehicles, captured thousands of prisoners, and proven themselves among the best armored units in Patton's entire army. But when they came home, their welcome was far quieter. In uniform, they marched through towns they'd fought to protect, and were told to use the colored entrances of diners. Some were refused service entirely. At train stations, they watched German prisoners of war walk freely, while they, the victors, were directed to segregated cars. The same nation they had risked their lives for greeted them with silence or suspicion, not gratitude. Staff Sergeant Floyd Day Jr., one of the battalion's veterans, would later say in an interview, "We fought for democracy overseas, but we couldn't find it when we got home. The war changed us, but America hadn't changed at all." Some tried to move on, to work, to raise families, to forget, but many carried invisible wounds. The world had been split open, and they had seen both its worst and its best. They'd fought Nazis abroad, then faced racism at home. Yet even in that injustice, the 761st stayed dignified. They had already proved who they were, where it mattered most. Under fire. Their heroism didn't vanish, though history tried to bury it. Their story was whispered among veterans, passed down quietly for decades. And slowly, America began to listen. Recognition came late, decades too late. For years, the 761st's achievements sat buried in paperwork, unacknowledged by an army that had moved on. White units received presidential unit citations and public honors. The Black Panthers received none. It wasn't until 1978, 33 years after the war, that President Jimmy Carter corrected that injustice. In a White House ceremony, the 761st Tank Battalion was finally awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Carter's words captured what history had missed. The 761st distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations. But even that wasn't the end. One name still hung in the air: Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. Captain David Williams had nominated him for the Medal of Honor back in 1944, but the paperwork vanished. Decades later, historians uncovered the original recommendation. It took until January 12, 1997, for President Bill Clinton to finally award it posthumously. At the ceremony, Clinton said, "No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for World War II received it. Today, we fill that gap in our history and honor the heroes who always deserved it." When Rivers' family accepted the medal, the room was silent. For once, America was not overlooking its heroes. It was learning their names. It wasn't just about one man. It was about every soldier who fought two wars, one against fascism and one against prejudice, and refused to lose either. The 761st Tank Battalion didn't just help win a war, they helped reshape a nation. Their performance became a cornerstone argument for President Truman's Executive Order 99981 in 1948, the directive that officially desegregated the U.S. military. When skeptics questioned whether integrated forces could function effectively, commanders pointed to the 761st record, 6 campaigns, 183 days of combat, and unmatched discipline under fire. In the decades that followed, the Panthers' legacy reached far beyond the Army. Military historians cited their tactics as key examples of adaptive warfare, how training and intelligence could overcome superior enemy firepower. Civil rights leaders pointed to them as living proof that equality wasn't an experiment. It was a fact proven on the battlefield. Their motto, "Come out fighting," became more than words. It was a philosophy that carried through generations of black soldiers who followed. The battalion's veterans went on to become police officers, teachers, community leaders. They had already shown the world what was possible when courage met purpose, and they never stopped living that truth. Today, their story is taught in military academies, displayed in the National World War II Museum, and honored at Fort Cavazos, Texas, where a monument stands. 4 granite tablets surrounding a statue of a kneeling tanker, engraved with a panther and a tank. Beneath it, a simple inscription: "To those who fought 2 wars, one against an enemy abroad and one against prejudice at home." The story of the 761st isn't just about war. It's about contradiction. These men fought to liberate a world that didn't fully see them as free. They shattered the myth of racial inferiority not by argument, but by action. Every mile they advanced, every tank they repaired under fire, was a statement. Character is not defined by color. Even the German soldiers who faced them understood. Many interrogated prisoners confessed their disbelief. "We were told they would run. They didn't. They kept coming." In those moments, the 761st became something more than soldiers. They became truth made visible. Their courage forced 2 nations to look in the mirror. One built its empire on racial purity and died by that lie. The other built its ideals on equality and had to confront its own failure to live up to them. The Black Panthers exposed both. That's what makes their story timeless. It isn't just military history, it's a challenge that echoes even now. A reminder that prejudice, when faced with excellence, collapses. The 761st didn't wait for permission to prove themselves. They made the battlefield their argument, and history had no choice but to listen. In the final months of the war, as the guns fell silent and Europe began to rebuild, the men of the 761st rolled their tanks to a stop. The engines quieted, the mud hardened, the adrenaline drained away, leaving only exhaustion and the memories of those who didn't come home. They'd lost nearly half their number, 71 tanks destroyed or abandoned, but their spirit never broke. In 183 days, they had fought across 6 nations and rewritten the story of what it meant to be a soldier. Decades later, one veteran summed it up with a few simple words: "We weren't fighting for what America was. We were fighting for what it could be." That's the heart of the 761st Tank Battalion. Not just victory, but belief. Belief that courage can outlast hate, that truth can outfight propaganda. That one battalion, overlooked and underestimated, could help change the course of a nation. The German Tigers expected easy prey. Instead, they met the Black Panthers, men who fought without rest, without recognition, and without surrender. And in proving the world wrong, they became something far greater than soldiers. They became the measure of what freedom truly costs and what it truly means.